So welcome. Welcome to the CEDS Post-Secondary Work Group. We're very excited to have you all. If you are willing and interested, you're more than welcome to turn your video on. Others will be able to see you. Do make sure, however,
I know Matt had mentioned that
phone is muted.
some changes.
And that way we don't get a lot of interference. So just make sure if you're using computer audio, whatever, that it's muted while others are speaking, and then when you want to speak, please feel free to speak up. Okay, so we're just going to get started. In 2012, CEDS added post-secondary to the standard for CEDS, and at that time we had an established work group. They came together, they developed out the post-secondary domain, and since that time, each year as the next iteration of the standard has come out, elements have been added regarding post-secondary. However, since 2012, we've not had a holistic view of the post-secondary domain and really kind of a little bit of a deeper dive. We've added elements that are necessary, but not necessarily looking to see how can we go back and make sure that the changes, or excuse me, the elements that exist within post-secondary really fit with the whole concept of early childhood to K-12 to post-secondary to workforce. Where can we make those consistencies across all of those particular domains? So that's where this work group comes in. Excuse me. So we will, as you all know, because you signed up for it, we will be reviewing and updating the CEDS post-secondary domain in just a bit. I'm going to get into a little bit more about what that looks like. But that is the main goal of this portion of the work group. However, we do recognize, and after hearing from a number of you about what you hope to get out of CEDS, the other piece of it is re-engaging that post-secondary community around CEDS and building a network for all participants. So not just a network for the CEDS team or for you to the CEDS team, but also amongst yourselves. I know I heard from several folks about wanting to talk to others that deal with the transition from K-12 to post-secondary, or that deal with this post-secondary use case, or how they collect data, or whatever. So having that community, and then as we move forward and we complete the domain review, what else is it that you all want to talk about and look to? And we can certainly modify the work group at that point, whether it's how often we meet or the work to be done. So we'll just continue to talk through that. When we put out the call for folks to join the post-secondary work group, we were very pleased and appreciative that 48 of you responded. So we have 48 members in our post-secondary work group. Of those 48 members, 10 of them are from K-12 SEAs. 15 of them are from post-secondary state agencies. And then you can see across here all the states that are either a K-12 SEA or a post-secondary state agency. And then you see the ones that are both purple and green. That's where we had states where someone from the K-12 SEA and someone from the post-secondary state agency both volunteered for this work group. So it's very exciting. There's 8 of those, and what's exciting about that is that it helps to build that communication between the K-12 sector and the post-secondary sector. Sometimes those are separated. It's a little difficult to pass data back and forth. So having folks from both of those within a single state is exciting to see as we review the post-secondary domain. We also have 4 private and public institutions, post-secondary institutions. So very excited about that. And we have 12 standards bodies, federal TA centers, vendors, and national associations. So you see those listed here. So very excited that we are getting the perspective of K-12. We're getting the perspective of post-secondary. We've got some, and I'm noticing now that I didn't have this one listed, so my apologies to you all, but we do have some from departments of labor. So that's very exciting. We have folks from actually from the institution. So we've got the state level, we've got the institution local level. We have folks that deal with the technical assistance. So they're helping people as they collect their data or as they store it or use it. So that's exciting. The standards bodies are the ones who are setting standards out there in various areas. CEDS certainly looks to those standards to determine what needs to be in CEDS. So having them on board is very important. You all who are vendors, that's very important because you're working with those institutions, you're working with those K-12 sectors or those post-secondary agencies. And so understanding and helping to influence the standard, because you look at it across many different states. That's an important perspective that we have here. And then finally, the national associations. Once again, you all are hearing from so many, very often all 50 states or what is it, 56, 61 SEAs, all different levels, again, K-12, post-secondary, sometimes workforce. So having this group run the gamut of possibility of stakeholders is very important, and each of your perspectives is going to be important as we move through this work to make sure that what we are putting out is important to each of you and works for each of you, right? We want to make sure that we're not doing something that will end up isolating post-secondary as opposed to making it easier for tracking those students as they move through their educational career. So one of the things that I did prior to this call is to send out to all of you the question about what do you hope to get out of working through this work group. And you responded, actually more than half of you responded to the question, which was wonderful to read. Everyone had kind of a unique perspective. And so it was exciting to see what you all are hoping to get out of this. We did end up kind of categorizing it into these 7 categories that you see here on the screen right now. And I just want to walk through those for a minute with you. So first and foremost, we'll start at the top left, and that's standardizing post-secondary definitions via CEDS. Some folks were saying things like they just want to see what's in CEDS. They're not even sure what's in there for post-secondary. Others were saying they really want to make sure that there's standard definitions across the states or across institutions, that sort of thing. So really kind of a big bucket, which is wonderful because we're about to do the post-secondary domain review. So this is a great place to start. And then others of you went a little bit deeper in some aspects or maybe came at it from a different perspective, and that was reaching the research community. How can CEDS help? How can we bring them in? How can the standardization help that community? Or application of CEDS in state systems. We have some states who have implemented the CEDS integrated data store. You want more information about that. Is that available at the post-secondary level, or are there APIs for the data? Anything about moving that data, storing it, that sort of thing. And then if you go down to that lower tier, it was around learning what post-secondary data other people collect. So again, about that network that I mentioned early on. Building that network, finding out what others are collecting. Do you need to be collecting it? Or maybe if you're from a vendor, what is it that folks are collecting that we don't yet have in our vendor system? You know, things like that. And through that, and one of the reasons that it's so important to standardize is to make sure that we have high data quality. It also helps with creating efficiencies for mandatory reporting. So have that as a goal. And then there is tracking that transition, which I talked about a little bit, from the K-12 to the post-secondary to the workforce, not just the transition, but also the looking back, right? So things like high school feedback reports, right? Where you're looking at, this is how many kids we graduated, and this is how many went on to post-secondary, and from that, this is how many actually got a degree, and this is how many went on to be in the workforce, etc. And if I can just remind you to put your computers or phones or whatever on mute, just to make sure we don't have feedback. So anyway, all of this is leading towards helping with post-secondary use cases. And by assisting with post-secondary use cases, it really came in at a lot of different levels. So we tried to capture that as succinctly as possible, but it was things like, what are the post-secondary use cases? How are people using it? What do they need to do with it? They were things like, I want to help folks with their post-secondary use cases. How can I help them? What needs do they have? And I just want to learn about the use cases and the data that's available and things like that. So all of this, standardizing, learning what's collected, getting with that research community, it all centers around the post-secondary use cases. So what I want to do now is take a few minutes and hear from you all about a little bit more about your goals. So I summarized them right here, but want to hear from you all. There's 48 of you, just to remind you. So we might not be able to hear from everyone today, but I did want to hear from as many as possible. And I just want to start with that top left hand. So if there are folks who responded that they were interested in standardizing the post-secondary definitions via CEDS, if you can maybe come off mute and speak up for a moment about why you might have said that and what you're hoping to get out of this work group.
Okay, I can start. My name is Raybuck. I'm from New Hampshire. I had mentioned the need for that because I think post-secondary, most people use National Student Clearinghouse data, and the variables are so varied, and to be able to look at other states, New Hampshire is struggling with a pretty low post-secondary rate, and I think it's just how you aggregate the data. What do you count as a graduate? What do you count as a college enrollment? Is it immediate college enrollment or within 16 months of enrollment? When do we get the data from National Student Clearinghouse? There's a lot of variables that can affect that rate. So it's not really usable data. I mean, it's not accurate. So if we have a standard definition, and we can use the EDFACS definitions as much as we can, but unless all the data elements that go into the rate are defined, it would be very helpful so that you can look at apples to apples.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. Anyone else?
Yes, hi Nancy, this is Manos Stefanakos from Puerto Rico.
Hey.
So one of the things that I wanted to do is to help figure out how can we, and I guess in your categorization, it's really assisting with post-secondary use cases, but to make sure the data model addresses the needs that people have from the data, because in the end, the collection and the aggregation that we do is meant to help somebody make the right decisions for groups or individual learners.
Absolutely. Great. Great point there. Good. All right, are there any others around standardizing? Okay. And I'm not going to go through all 7 of these, but what about the application of CEDS in state systems? Is there anyone who wants to speak up about why they might have propose that that's why they joined the work group.
Nancy, this is Tom McNaughton from North Dakota University System. One of the things that I wanted to take away was a better understanding of how to actually integrate and use the CEDS within our organization. We have 11 institutions and we're very diverse in some of our definitions, but in line with others. Also just trying to find a way to make the data more efficient as we work on that consistency. And lastly, just increasing my own personal knowledge of how we can utilize CEDS just better across the entire state of North Dakota.
Great. That's awesome. And we can definitely help you with that. So great. Anybody else on the application of CEDS in state systems? Okay. I'm going to skip down to the tracking the transition from K-12 to post-secondary to workforce. Is there anyone who wants to speak up on it?
Hi, Nancy. This is Glenn from California Department of Education. So our interest is California is doing a Cradle to Workforce project mandated by our legislature. And one of the things that we struggled with over the past few months is kind of that sharing terminology between the post-secondary, our institutions of post-secondary education and workforce, and the K-12 and the early childhood segment. So one of our goals around this is, one, staying engaged with CEDS so we don't lose track of it, and two, being able to use it as one of our tools to be able to communicate, to talk about what data we all have, what can we share, how does it transition. We have a standard definition to go to, and just really being engaged in the overall process.
Wonderful. And that's a great point. Having that standard definition between each of those certainly helps to track that student as they move through their educational career, and helps on your end of then following them, seeing what programs worked, what course sequences might have worked, that sort of thing. So definitely helpful. Yes.
Hi, this is Vlad Buses, Iowa. We also have a system of tracking students from community colleges to further education or workforce for a number of applications. It's a bit more complicated to track high school students because of technical difficulties with obtaining social security numbers, but otherwise the system is rather developed.
Awesome.
And it's Larry from Access for Learning. I think the different ways now that kids are making that transition, we're going to get past this idea if you go through grade 12 and you go into higher education, they're doing that at freshman year in some cases. So I think community college involvement in the higher education four-year institutions, it's a different model than what we're all used to, just going grade 12 and moving on. You're moving on at different stages when you're in that secondary level.
Yes, the problem with initial cohort based only on the state students is that, of course, in community colleges and in other higher educational institutions, there are many students that do not belong to the stage. It didn't start with the same cohort, yet they're an important factor in figuring out the total population with higher education or good jobs. So it's important to take care of all cohorts, not just those that start in local high schools.
Very good. And so that speaks to as well the importance of the ability to share data across state lines, right? Because they might have started at a high school that's in another state and then needing to get that information, the transcript, et cetera. And I know that there have been improvements in the ability to get those transcripts electronically, but it can even be a matter of then transcribing that information into how your data system collects it. And so having one of those standard definitions across would definitely make that work even more efficient. Great. Anybody else on transition? Okay. Then the last one I was going to do, unless afterwards you all can speak up about any of them really. But the last one I wanted to really point out is the assisting with post-secondary use cases. I know we've kind of heard that off and on through all of these responses, and that's why it's kind of that overarching one on the right-hand side. But does anybody in particular, was that really their focus on why they joined the work group?
Hi, Nancy. Yeah, this is Sarah Colby. I work in the California State University system with a group that is particularly focused on teacher preparation and teacher education in the CSU system. And that's my main reason for joining, is to understand just more about the CEDS post-secondary domain and try to fit that together with what the data needs are for teacher preparation, and understand how well the CEDS domain fits what our data needs are and what the use cases might be for teacher preparation and teacher education. Thanks.
Okay, great. Yes, teacher preparation is a huge area. So awesome. Glad to hear that. Any others? Okay. And then I will just do one last call. Does anybody have any about any one of these? It doesn't have to be any of those, or some other reason on that you want to share about why you joined this work group. Okay, no problem. I know there's a lot of people on this, so speaking up sometimes can be a little intimidating in that case. So I appreciate those of you who contributed to the response to the email, who spoke up today, and we definitely appreciate all of you for joining the work group. So speaking of standardizing, which we've talked a bit about why that would be important, I want to move into kind of what is the work group going to do. And obviously CEDS is a standard, it's Common Education Data Standards. And so I want to talk about this kind of the steps that you all are going to go through. So first and foremost, you're going to be looking at the post-secondary domain. It is available out there right now. So if you've not been there, the CEDS website, ceds.ed.gov, you can simply click on Elements. Excuse me, and if you look at the first button, the one on the far left there, it says View DES, which is Domain Entity Schema. That's our contextual model, right? So you can go in and something like first name. First name exists for students, for parents, for staff at early childhood, at K-12, post-secondary workforce, all of that, right? But within the domain entity schema, you will see it under those, for each of those instances, rather than just seeing first name one time. So that's a great way to go through the post-secondary domain. You can expand post-secondary on there, and you can see all the different categories that are in there, or entities. And so we'll be going through those. We are going to have some committees, because there's 48 of you, and that's quite a bit of you to actually sit down and have some meaningful conversations. So we're going to break them into smaller groups. We're going to have committees, which I'll talk about in just a minute about what those are and how you can get in those committees. But what each committee will be doing is reviewing, what is in CEDS. Are there new elements needed? Are there new option sets within existing elements? Do we need to get rid of some elements? And this is where it's going to be very important to have those various perspectives that I talked about earlier, the K-12, the post-secondary, the workforce, the national associations, because you guys have a national view, the public and private institutions, all of that is going to be very important as we go through this. One thing that we did do recently is CEDS had an iPads group kind of start off for this post-secondary work group, many of whom are in this work group now. But they started out, they went through iPads, and they developed connections, CEDS connections, which is a use case, and you define out the elements necessary in order to respond to iPads. So they built 12 connections corresponding to the 12 components of iPads. And through that work, we found that there were, across the 12 components, there were 40 elements that are not in CEDS. Now, in some cases, they're not in CEDS at all. In some cases, they're in K-12, but they're not in post-secondary. And in other cases, the element exists, but we just need to add a different option in order to make it compliant with the information necessary for iPads. So each of the work groups, three of the 4 work groups will be going through that. They'll be going through the elements from the iPads review, kind of starting there, but also between now and when your committee starts up, you can start to go through the post-secondary domain on your own, thinking about use cases of why you use data, why you use post-secondary data, how do you use it, what is it being used for, and thinking through that, kind of clicking open some of those entities and those categories and getting down to the elements, and just, you don't have to read all the element details, you don't have to read the definition, etc., but just seeing that those elements are there. Do you see anything major that's missing? And just jotting that down, saving that for your committee, and then bringing it up there where we can then go through and see, yes, CEDS does not have this, the committee needs to discuss that, that topic. Or, no, CEDS actually does have it, let us show you where that might be. So it's a great exercise. It shouldn't take you too long, and you can do it just kind of off and on between now and your committee meeting, but just to kind of get you thinking through the CEDS post-secondary domain. The other piece of it is that when we are updating CEDS, we like to look to existing standards. There's some new ones that have been emerging, or some that already exist but that have had additions to them. And we like to make sure that we are looking to that and we're incorporating those elements or new options within existing elements where it fits for CEDS, right? So wherever those use cases fit within CEDS, we want to talk about having those incorporated. We also look to federal reporting requirements. So I mentioned the iPads, right? And so we look to that to say, okay, CEDS needs to get, in sync by incorporating these 40 elements, right? How can CEDS be in sync with the federal reporting? So we do that on the EdFact side and for K-12, and then this is post-secondary, so we're going to do it on the iPad side. As you all are moving through all of this, CEDS does have guidelines for naming conventions. We have different kinds of elements. So we have elements with just the base name. We also have elements that are for type, for indicator, for status, identifier, and then there's others as well. We do have it documented around those naming conventions. How do you know which one to use, kind of thing. So I will be sending out a follow-up email to this work group meeting. And one of the things that will be included in that follow-up email is a copy of the CEDS naming conventions. I'll also include the link of where it is on the CEDS site so that you can bookmark it if you need to. But I know a lot of times folks like to get that actual document and just go ahead and save it somewhere. So I'll send you that document. You can read through it. I think it's 3 to 5 pages, so it shouldn't take you very long to read through. But it will help you as we are starting up these committees. You will be aware of the different kinds of elements that we have in CEDS, how they might be worded, that sort of thing. So that if your committee is coming up with new elements, we are going to need to follow those conventions, right? So you'll be aware of that. And then once your committee decides, yes, this set of elements needs to be in CEDS, you will be going through the CEDS open source community. Now, the open source community was established earlier this year. So this will be the first large effort, potentially, of going through the open source community process, okay? And what will happen is you all will work through your elements that you want or updates to existing elements, that sort of thing, and then you'll submit a it's called an issue ticket. And so you'll submit that through the open source community. And then what will happen is the larger CEDS community, so beyond just the 48 of you, the much larger CEDS community will have an opportunity to review that, comment about it, and then kind of say, yes, give the blessing, yes, we want this in CEDS. And at that point, it'll be added to CEDS, and then it'll be folded into the next official version of CEDS. Okay. So I talked for a minute about committees. Let me go through some of the examples and really kind of talk through what types of committees we're going to have. So right now we are planning for 4 committees. And the first one is external source updates. I mentioned before that there's other standards out there. Some examples are EdFi's teacher prep data model, Credential Engine has standards, that sort of thing. So that committee will be looking at what standards are out there and which ones do we need to look at, you know, aligning with CEDS. Do we need to bring, do the two match up? Do we need to bring additional elements in, that sort of thing? And so starting to talk about that work. The timeline, which I'm going to go over in just a second, may not allow that you actually get all the way through all of that analysis for all of the different standards, but definitely to start to set that timeline and determine who can do the work and what do we need to do in order to make sure CEDS is staying up to date with existing standards that are available. So then the next committee is around organization and institution. This is post-secondary, obviously, post-secondary organization, institution, but it would include things like, and this is coming from the IPEDS review that we did, things like there were elements missing around libraries, interlibrary loans, where is the actual library, some things like that. So around libraries, around services and programs, we already have a ton of services and programs listed in CEDS or places for them. But in particular for IPEDS, they need to know about services and programs for military personnel and veterans. So how do we incorporate that? Does that just need to be an additional option set within an existing element, or does something new need to be created for that altogether? And another example for organizations and institutions is sports type. So we have some information in there about a student being an athlete, but not necessarily what types of sports are offered at an institution. And are they NCAA, or, you know, what organization are they within? Okay, so then the third committee is staff, and there is an entire category already there around staff. There's tons of information, but we did find some elements through the IPEDS review that were missing. So for instance, there's some elements about income level. So certainly there's salary. So some conversation needs to happen around, does the elements that exist, does that meet the need of the IPEDS reporting, or does something else need to happen? So it's around income level, fringe benefits, that sort of thing. But then there's also things like sabbatical leave. Interestingly enough, sabbatical leave is in CEDS, but only at the K-12 level. So then it would be a matter of the committee discussing and saying, yes, we definitely need sabbatical leave at the post-secondary level, and then submitting a use case through that open source community saying, we just need to add this instance to post-secondary. We don't want to change anything on the element or anything. We just want to get it in post-secondary as well, and here's where we think it would fit, that sort of thing. And then finally, there is student. Through the review, we noticed a couple of elements, and the one that I'm going to give as an example today is around demographic 2 or more races. Back when we were originally adding post-secondary to CEDS, we had a post-secondary work group, as I mentioned, and the thought and thinking at that time, again, this was, 7 years ago, was still very much K-12 is K-12, post-secondary is post-secondary. We're not mixing the two kind of thing. As you know, over the last 7 years, there has been an evolution in the thinking around data, and it's, you know, this whole concept of this transition from K-12 to post-secondary to workforce, et cetera. Well, one of those pieces is that under the student, race and ethnicity is listed out, one for each. So there's Asian, African American, white, whatever, just as it is in K-12. But in K-12, they also have demographic 2 or more races. Now in post-secondary, you can figure it out if you have 2 or more races. But through the IPEDS review, you do have to report on 2 or more races. And so the IPEDS review committee was proposing that that demographic 2 or more races element get added to the post-secondary student, just like it is in K-12. So that's kind of the idea there. It will also be looking through the students, seeing, you know, what about the context here? Are there things here that folks are used to in K-12 that would work well here? Are there things here that would work well for K-12? So just kind of keeping all of that in mind. Okay, so those are the 4 committees that are available for you all to work on. And when I say work on, and I'm going to switch now to the timeline. So today we're having the initial meeting, and then this week, probably this afternoon, I will be getting a follow-up email out to you all. That follow-up email will include a link to a Google form. On that Google form, it asks for 2 things. 1, your name, and 2, you have to check off all the committees you're interested in serving on. Now, before you go and check off all 4 of them, I just want you to be aware of what that means. So let me walk through this timeline. January to August, the committees will be meeting. Some committees will only meet once a month. Some may meet twice a month. I'm really going to leave it up to the committee leads on that, and depending on the amount of work that the committee really needs to get done. So once or twice a month for the next 8 months. Okay, so you all would be meeting then. In addition to that, we're going to get the full work group back together every other month. So February, April, June, August. And the purpose of that is for you to report out about the committee work that you did, right? So that the full work group can hear it, can have some thinking about it, and then can message you or speak up on that work group call about where the committee landed, right? About a particular element. Well, have you thought of this perspective? That sort of thing. Because then at that point, once the elements are brought to the work group the work group meeting, and then everyone agrees to it, then the committee can go back and submit their use case. Okay, so all of that's going to happen between January and August. And excuse me, and then in August, the domain review will be complete for version 9. Now, I don't want to say that the domain review is going to be done, right? Because I mentioned before that the external sources, the external standards, other ones, might take a bit longer. So I hesitate to say it'll be done, but it will be done for version 9. And the reason for that is between August and November, you should have had, by the end of August, you should have all of your elements that you're going to submitted as a use case in the open source community. That will give the community time to look at and respond. And certainly if you finish them earlier, that's great. You can go ahead and get them submitted. But definitely by the end of August, it'll give the committee time, the community time to respond, as well as the CEDS team between August and November pulls it together for the draft public comment period. And you may have seen the emails or been on the webinar earlier this week about the version 8 draft. And we're currently in that cycle right now for version 8. And the public comment period ends December 20th. And then in February, the official version 8 of CEDS will come out. So it's the same kind of timeline for version 9, right? So in August, we need any use cases that are going to be submitted for version 9. Those need to be in there. The community will have time to discuss, as well as the CEDS team will have time to pull it together for that public comment in November. And then February of 2021, version 9 will be released, okay? So all of that is to say, be kind of thinking about, what you have going on and how much time you can devote to the committees, We are asking that everyone sign up for at least one committee, but before you sign up for multiple committees, just consider the commitment there, okay? So it is those meetings that I mentioned, January to August, at least one a month, potentially 2 a month, as well as there will be some asynchronous work between those meetings that you can do on your own, submitting through discussion threads, things like that, okay? So before I move on to going through all these action items, which if you want to take a screenshot, this is a great time for that. But I will be sending out this PowerPoint when I send the Google link. I will be sending out a copy of this PowerPoint, so feel free to keep that in mind. But I do want to talk about the Grads 360 workspace. It's the one in the bottom right of your screen right now. And so one of the things that we want to do is not only have those committee meetings, but also have the opportunity to engage virtually. So there is already a CEDS community of practice, and within there is the open source community, okay? Since the review and the elements and everything will be going through the open source community, we are standing up a workspace specifically for the post-secondary work group. So in that workspace, it will have things like meeting notices, there will be discussion threads, there will be folders for documentation, that sort of thing. So you will be able to use that to communicate with one another, all right? As I said, we are in the process of standing that up. The goal is that by the beginning of January, that we will have that ready to go. And what that means is that when your committee meets beginning in January, when they meet, one of the first things the committee lead will do is a brief demonstration of the community of practice so that you understand how to get in there and you understand what the different pieces and parts are and how you can interact and engage virtually, okay? So if you have not used the CEDS community of practice, don't worry, we'll help you along with that. So now I just want to run through the action items, and then once I get through this, I'll pause and take any questions from you all. So committee sign up, as I mentioned, I'm going to send an email with that Google link, okay? So if you guys can sign up for at least one committee by December 31st, then the committee lead will begin scheduling those meetings. Once we have everybody by December 31st, that's why it's important to have them on time by December 31st, because January 2nd, we're going to start looking at when can we schedule those meetings, right? So we want to go ahead and get those out. I will go ahead and look at the calendar now, between now and January, to get the February, April, June, August large work group meetings scheduled. So I'll go ahead and get those scheduled for you all, because I know sometimes that's helpful if it's already scheduled far in advance. So we'll go ahead and try and do that. In the meantime, between now and your first committee meeting, think about what committee you signed up for and go into CEDS, look at that domain entity schema, particularly around the area you signed up for, and start to just kind of jot down a little list of, oh, I noticed this wasn't in there, or I couldn't find this, or whatever that you're noticing. If you don't have time to go into the domain entity schema, even thinking through your daily work of, let's say you sign up for the student committee, what do I do regarding student data? How am I using that? Start jotting those use cases down. Those will be important items to bring forward in the committee, to have those conversations, to remind yourself when you're discussing particular elements, does this element fit that use case, right? So these are going to be all important things to do. So just kind of start thinking about that before the committees start. And then for the Grads 360, which is the community of practice, for that, we will finish setting that up and we will get you all added by the beginning of January. We will get everyone added. If you don't already have a CEDS community of practice account, we will add one, and then you'll get an email letting you know that you've been added. We will also send out written instructions about the workspace, but again, your committee lead at one of the first meetings will go over a demonstration of that and kind of how to interact with that. Okay, so now we have about 15 minutes left for the call. I know I threw a lot at you today, so I just want to pause and see if anyone has any questions. Okay, and now I'm looking at the group chat, and so just want to make sure everyone saw this. Question was, when you send out the questionnaire to sign up for committees, will you include a description of the scope, focus of each committee as a reminder? And yes. We already developed the Google form, but we will double check that that is, I believe that's already in there, but we will double check to make sure for certain, to make sure you know what you're signing up for. All right, are there any other questions from anyone? Okay. Not hearing anyone and not seeing any chat coming through. I do once again want to thank you on behalf of the CEDS team for joining the post-secondary work group. It is so important that the stakeholders are part of this process and are driving the standard. And so it is wonderful to see so many of you willing to participate and to use your time to help build out the CEDS post-secondary domain. So thank you very much. If you have any questions between now and your committee meetings, or really at any time, whether it's about CEDS, this work group in particular, or whatever, feel free to reach out to me. I know all of you have my email address. So feel free to reach out to me at any time and I'll be happy to help you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.